Ardennes Forest, December 1944. The mist had thickened with the dawn. Frost clung to pine needles. The ground squelched under boots not made for winter. Silence pulsed like a heartbeat between distant cracks of gunfire in the distance. But here, in this moment, there was only the sound of breath, steam rising from lips, feet slapping cold earth as German infantry scrambled through the trees. A young corporal, barely 19, turned to shout over his shoulder, "Keep moving! The ridge is—" He never finished. He simply vanished. Not into shadows, not behind a tree, just gone. A shell, silent until the last second, landed 10 feet behind him. It didn't just detonate. It erased. The ground buckled. The blast tore apart the trees with splinters sharp as bayonets. Bark, blood, mud, and metal flew in the same red arc. 2 more men went down before anyone understood they were under fire. There were no visible guns, no tanks, no warning. Just the sound of a life ending before anyone could hear it happening. One sergeant collapsed into a crater, screaming for his legs that were no longer there. Another dug his face into freezing moss as overhead branches fell like burning arrows. And above it all, the echoing sentence of American artillery, rhythmic, measured, merciless. Later, in captivity, one of them would say it best. There were no riflemen, no tanks, just explosions that never stopped. You didn't die facing the enemy. You didn't even get to say goodbye. American artillery didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived with silence, followed by the sky falling apart. Somewhere near Bastogne, December 1944. The cold could split knuckles, but the artillerymen didn't complain. Not tonight. Corporal Joe Hanley spit on a rag and rubbed it gently across the steel face of his M2 105mm howitzers breech block, like a priest handling relics before Mass. His gloves lay at his feet, fingers stiff, unreadable from the biting wind, but he didn't mind. This was routine, ritual. The firepower gods had their own form of prayer, and it started with good metal, clean oil, and total focus. Across the frozen clearing, others laughed around a cookpot throwing steam into the night. Coffee barely warm. Spam again. A crude drawing of a pin-up burned into a crate. Cards on a crate top. Low jokes. Nervous energy disguised as confidence. They shoot at us? Only if they want to meet God early. They weren't cocky. They were conditioned. After all, they fired first. They didn't crawl through frost-bitten ditches wondering when the sky would fall. They pulled the cords that made hell descend on someone else, and it made all the difference. 100 yards behind them, stacked 3 deep beneath snowy camo nets, the howitzers pointed toward the dark tree line, where German positions waited in silence. This was the night before the storm. Both sides felt it. Just on the other side, a different kind of silence hung thick. In the woods barely 2 kilometers away, huddled beneath fir branches and half-frozen tarps, German infantrymen whispered in their own fog. Their breaths came hot through scarves. Fingers blew on triggers. Boots soaked through from melting snow. One passed a flask of schnapps. Another stared at nothing, as if seeing tomorrow would burn less than thinking about it. The word had come. American guns were heavily dug in. Sighting ranges complete. Fixed batteries. Artillery? Someone asked. "They have plenty," came the answer. "We have mortars." No one answered after that. Private Klaus Mertens, barely 20, scribbled in his pocket journal that night, using a stump as a table, hands shaking. Americans don't sleep in holes like we do. They sleep behind steel mouths that never miss. Back at the American encampment, Hanley slid the rag one last time along the barrel and nodded to no one in particular. This wasn't fear, it was focus. "They've got nerve," he said, not looking up. "But we've got God's loudest voice." And when the dawn came, and whispers gave way to motion, the men on one side would wait to die, and the men on the other would listen for coordinates and pull the cord. Firepower versus fear. Command versus chaos. One side aimed the thunder. The other side waited for the lightning. Central Italy. Winter, 1943. The ground was dry for once. Blessedly dry, boots didn't sink. The mules trudged without protest. Sunlight cracked the mountain veil. And for 3 days, the German 192nd Infantry Regiment moved like they meant it. They laughed over tin mugs. Officers studied paper maps with untouched corners. A captain joked that the Americans had probably withdrawn already. You know the type, too many comforts to fight in the hills. Once we break this pass, said Oberst Helmut Kreuter as he folded his scope, we'll take their supply line by midday. The battalion moved in spread formation, up a trail skirting the ravine. A poor path, but clear. What they didn't see were the blackened steel mouths hidden just above them. Silent, covered in tree limbs and hand-painted rock camouflage, American 155mm and 105mm howitzers nestled into the ridgelines of Monte Lungo. They had already been watching. Their guns were already sighted. Their ranges set. At arrow 9:30 hours, the cannons opened. There was no warning, just percussion. Sound so deep it knocked birds from the trees. A forward platoon, 60 men marching in staggered ranks, ceased to exist moments. Later, the lead mule popped like a water balloon. Bodies flipped, earth fractured. A crater swallowed boots whole. Behind them, coordination vanished. Horses kicked free. Radios screamed static. Men threw themselves against mud walls that cracked under pressure. No enemy was visible. Only the air was angry. Kreuter thought it was a misfire at first. Badly timed mortar. Then came the second volley. Dozens of shells, orchestrated like a drumline of judgment. Every exit route became trenchwork of shredded olive brush and twitching limbs. Soldiers crawled, then huddled, then waited. By 1,000 hours, no one moved. Survivors would later say they imagined something watching them, like the mountain itself had become a machine, and they weren't fighting soldiers. They were being punished. The rear company tried to redirect, loop around and push toward high ground, but were met with a pre-sighted rain of high-explosive shells. Horses snapped their own reins. Ammo crates exploded. Medics screamed louder than the injured. By noon, it was done. The American positions had never truly been located. The German maps weren't just outdated. They were irrelevant. The hills had swallowed their confidence and spat back paused ambition and broken. Morse tap. 3 days later, Kreuter was captured near Sant'Elia, shivering, wounded in the leg, and still unsure how many in his unit were left. An American interpreter asked what he thought of the defenders, the men his team never saw. Kreuter looked out the window of his tented holding cell and said, "It took us days to learn we were fighting clouds. You aim at soldiers, but clouds, they strike from anywhere, and by the time the rain falls, your map doesn't matter." This wasn't just about firepower. It was about control. The Americans didn't just stop a battalion that day. They didn't just kill men. They crushed momentum, unraveled maps, and turned planning into panic, because when artillery speaks, strategy folds. Near Saint-Lô, France, July 1944, Operation Cobra. The farmhouse was already halfway ruined before the shelling ever began. The windows were missing, rafters cracked, the roof slouched like it knew its days were numbered. The German machine gun team inside had taken shelter out of exhaustion more than strategy. 2 floors, stone walls, an illusion of safety. Feldwebel Matthias Gruber, 27, held position at the rear window with his MG-42 braced on overturned furniture. He chewed a cigarette filter that no longer burned. His spotter, Eric, leaned against the cracked wall, scribbling in a journal he'd never finish. Outside, the hedgerows crackled. Somewhere in the distance, the invisible rattle of tank treads off rhythm, like a church bell swinging without a clapper. They had an hour, maybe 2. What they didn't know was that coordinates had already been called in, and American gunners were loading charges 2 ridgelines away. It started. Without a whistle, just a flash. Then the ground rose. Up Gruber's ears didn't register the sound. His nerves did. His first thought wasn't incoming. It was, how are we already dead? The wall exploded inward, not collapsed, detonated. Dust swallowed the room. Shrieks ripped across the floorboards. Shards of timber rained down like glass shrapnel. Eric screamed once. A sharp intake that ended too quickly. The MG didn't fall. Matthias dropped with it. He crawled face first into blood and dirt, blinking against drifting cloth that had once been a curtain, now soaked through in red and dust. Then the next round landed, this time closer. Then another. Then another. Time vanished. Sound stopped being sound. It became presence, a heavy circling force, vibrating the ribcage, speaking in the language of entropy. The floor swelled under him. The hallway wall evaporated inward. Tree limbs outside caught fire, ignited not by flame, but by proximity detonation. Through the cracked stone, Matthias could see the orchard ablaze. Green turned black, bark peeled off trunk like burned skin. Crows, or what was left of them, fell soundlessly between blasts. Two men tried to run from the barn next door. A shell landed beside them mid-step. Nothing remained but steam and shoulder straps. Gruber crawled. He didn't know where, didn't know what for. He couldn't hear. The blood from his nose wasn't warm anymore. He tried to call for Eric, but his voice didn't work. He looked at the MG-42, cracked down the receiver. Useless now, like everything else in that room, like him. 25 minutes might have passed. More shells. Every 20 seconds, another breath of judgment from far away. It was like being underwater with thunder living in your throat. When it stopped, not ended, just stopped, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was empty. Gruber sat upright, back against a cratered beam. There were bodies. He didn't count them, didn't recognize most of them. He looked up. Part of the ceiling had collapsed inward. A jagged triangle of sky above him. Cloudless, quiet. It was over, he wrote weeks later from a hospital cot. But not inside me. I no longer feared death. I feared waiting for it. When American infantry arrived, they found only one survivor inside the farmhouse ruins. Dazed, bleeding, barely conscious. He never lifted a weapon. He didn't surrender, because surrender implies you had a fight to begin with. Operation Cobra succeeded that day. Not just because roads opened or towns fell, but because the U.S. artillery had done what it was designed to do: kill the will before they ever saw your face. Artillery is not just a weapon. It is erosion. A half hour at a time. Monte Cassino, Italy. March 1944. The orders were precise. A 4-man German sapper and engineering team was to advance under cover of darkness, find the American forward battery hidden northeast of Cassino's slopes, and send back coordinates by radio. Simple objective. Critical for the counterattack. They moved fast, quiet, professional. But as they reached the first bend near the old vineyard wall, it became clear the map lied. What was once a winding carriage path now looked like the surface of the moon, cratered endlessly, curling into strange, unnatural depressions pockmarked with frozen water, blood, and broken helmets. Every landmark was obliterated. Every tree shattered or replaced by charred stumps. "We couldn't even find the creek," said Corporal Ernst Voss, the only man who returned. It had been erased, filled with impact holes and broken bones. They advanced anyway. They had no choice. Ernst traced the ridgeline with his optics, but it shimmered, heat still rising from recent shell bursts. Somewhere up there, American guns were sighted not at positions, but at prediction. They weren't firing at you. They were firing at where you would be. At 0200 hours, the team split left to scout up toward the objective. A runner stayed back to relay coordinates once confirmed. 30 seconds later, a whistle, then thunder. No warning, no flash, just one of them gone. The man had stepped into an old crater, where freshly packed American shells had been pre-sighted hours earlier. It was a trap, not one they could see, but one that was built into the earth. Even their footsteps betrayed them. The broken terrain made silent movement impossible. Radios crackled, then died. Power lines melted by near hits or jammed by interference. At 02:30, a second man crawled over a flattened trench split wide by a previous barrage. Another whistle. Closer this time. A proximity burst caught him in mid-crawl. His scream ended with impact. Red mist in the air, then nothing. Voss and his last man pushed on. Their breathing rapid now, eyes darting between shadows and stars. Visibility. Minimal. Cover. None. Hope. Evaporating. Their boots slipped in loose gravel and blood-darkened mud, sliding into half-made graves of other Germans who had tried this same mission and never made it back. "We marched with the dead," wrote Voss, "not behind us, beneath us." And then came the final shot. They never saw the flash, just a hiss behind them, and a sound like a slammed metal door opening underwater. The blast caught his comrade mid-turn. Body lifted, slammed, gone. No time for a cry. No time for goodbyes. Only steam rising from where a soldier had once stood. Voss dropped. He didn't finish the mission. He didn't even try. He just crawled. Backwards. Back through the abandoned gear, the twisted bodies, the shattered earth that looked more like open wounds than battlefield. Every step was betrayal, he said. The earth whispered, "But I couldn't understand what it meant," until it screamed. He was recovered the next day, half-conscious, frostbitten. The Americans never found the recon team, because they never needed to. They had already marked every path, already known every trench, already turned geography into artillery. In the report filed weeks later, Voss added a final note, barely legible in the margins. There were ghosts in the hills. They called them batteries. We never saw them. We only died where they expected us to be. The Americans hadn't just planted shells in the ground. They had planted war in the soil itself. Ardennes Forest, January 1945. The retreat came fast, not planned, not orderly. Snow turned red, then black, churned by boots and fear. The German counteroffensive had pushed hard, surprising entire battalions still recovering from frozen limbs and short rations. Company C of the 87th Infantry Division was among the first hit outside L'Outrebois, caught mid-realignment. Their lines buckled before they ever saw the enemy's helmets. But before they retreated, they called him Private First Class Daniel R. Cody, Forward Artillery, Observer, 23 years old, Brooklyn, High, school dropout. He knew shell weight better than grammar. He had a scar on his left ear from when his first radio battery exploded in his face, and, as the company pulled back through the burning pines, Daniel stayed. He wasn't ordered to, he just knew. He crouched behind a shattered stone wall that used to be someone's barn, bent over a grease-slick field receiver, antenna torn and stitched with wire. His arm had caught a ricochet 2 hours earlier, a thin gash running elbow to wrist that soaked through his sleeve. He hadn't bandaged it. He wasn't stopping to bleed. Not while the enemy was still too close. Not while the artillery team 3 clicks back was still asking, "Cody, adjust for elevation. What's your read on the second wave?" Smoke choked out the moonlight. Shells rumbled into distant trees. One round hit a horse-drawn cart that exploded into fire before Cody even flinched. He whispered into the mic, "Second line at 218, short by 30 meters. Bring it closer." They did. He could have joined the retreat. He could have limped back. Said his arm cracked on a stone, said the radio was damaged, said he'd done enough. But he didn't. He stayed because someone needed to dial the end of the world straight into coordinates. The enemy kept coming. 2 shapes sprinted over the far hedge. German infantry. Shadows with rifles and cold breath. Cody didn't raise a gun. He raised his gaze, then whispered again, "Multiple targets. North-northeast. Close fire. Tell the boys to send the heavy ones." The reply came slow, blurred transmission from a field gun that had already fired 20 rounds too many that day. "Copy that." "Cody, you still up there?" All he said was, "Still talking." Another blast landed near the wall, blew the window rafters into the snow. Splinters groaned in the floorboards. Cody's knee gave out. He dropped but didn't let go of the mic. Smoke came in deep, breathing like a second heartbeat in his, chest. He made one more correction. Squeezed. The call plate by instinct. Didn't even look to see if the fire rained. Down. He could feel it in the tremble of the earth. Then, he slumped sideways, brace snapped, radio cradled in his arms like a wounded friend. The last correction went through. The artillery hit hard, broke the German push. Company C slipped out, fewer in number, but alive. They never saw what stopped their pursuers. Just silence. And flame. 3 men returned an hour later, bodies frozen, boots dragging through smoldering debris. They found Cody behind the stone wall, slumped, bleeding from the side. Eyes open, but empty, crushed headset in one hand. Fingers, still curled around the transmitter. The last words, recorded in his notebook, still stuck under the antenna. "Casing there were barely legible through frozen ink. Don't. Correct for glory, just hit the ones chasing the EA. Boys." The men who recovered. Him never heard him fire a weapon. There was no dog tag. Around his neck, just a St. Christopher medallion, and half a photo of his kid brother back home. The battery commander, upon hearing what he did, said, "He didn't die behind a gun. He died giving ammunition a purpose." They buried Cody near the tree line, between the walls he defended and the coordinates he gave. No ceremony. Just a name. Just a silence louder than the shells he called. He stayed behind to keep the guns talking, not for revenge, not for orders, and not because he thought it would earn him a place in history. He did it because someone had to hold the cord, so others could cross the line he wouldn't live to reach. The battles stopped. The borders shifted. Peace returned, stubborn and exhausted. But some things didn't settle. Not in the treaties, not in the silence. Some things echoed. And among the veterans of the Wehrmacht, the Waffen-SS, the Panzer, divisions and Volksgrenadier reserves, one shared memory rose again and again in post-war interrogations. It was the American artillery, not the tanks, not the air raids, the artillery. In POW camps across Europe, Allied officers conducted interviews, tactical, procedural, psychological. They expected enemy praise for advanced Allied tanks or P-47 Thunderbolts screaming overhead. Instead, the captives spoke less about machines they could see, and more about the guns they never did. Why? Because it came unseen, said a POW interrogated in Belgium in early 1945. It arrived in places where you didn't expect to fight, and turned you into a statistic before you drew your rifle. Multiple prisoners from the Battle of the Bulge described it the same way. Like thunder, but smarter. Like the mountain was exploding. Like someone knew where I would run before I did. It wasn't a weapon they could fight. It wasn't something they could resist. It was fate delivered by mathematics. In one debriefing, a captured Waffen-SS officer broke down partway through his statement saying, "We were told we were the fiercest, the hardest to break. But when the shells came, that training didn't matter. We became rats, blind, scattering. God help the man standing when the batteries opened. From Sicily to St. Lo, from Monte Cassino to Hurtgen Forest, American artillery was called, not technically, but culturally, a god. It didn't argue. It didn't wait. It just answered." In his post-war memoir, General Lieutenant Karl Dietrich wrote a quiet line that summed what many others had stammered. The Americans had artillery as their god. Not even the Waffen-SS could pray it away. The most terrifying thing about American artillery, they said, was how impersonal it was. There was no face, no foe in a foxhole, no man screaming through a charge, just precision fire, corrections coming faster than they could dig or run. "We never got used to it," said one veteran in 1951. "Worst was when you escaped a barrage, because another one was almost always coming." Engineers analyzing battlefield remains found positions that had been pre-sighted with chilling accuracy. Shells fell not on coordinates, they fell on likely choices, trees that offered shade, bends in roads that offered faster movement. Everything friendly to a soldier had already been targeted. This wasn't just strategy, it was domination before contact, victory by erosion. Even decades later, many German war memoirs referred to American artillery with grim reverence, hell without a face. A professional silence punctuated by craters. The storm you deserved coming one fire mission at a time. The guns never needed to be seen, because by the time you saw them, you were either lucky or late. They weren't just tools of attrition. They were the invisible hand that rewrote German war plans across 3 continents. "They never reached the guns," one American colonel later said, "because we didn't let them, and because we didn't need to." Standing still was deadly. Moving invited fire. Digging meant heat. Retreating meant you hadn't died yet, but you were scheduled. Artillery wasn't just American support, it was American identity. Rage refined into pure discipline. And in the end, what the Germans remembered was that they lost the war before they ever saw the barrel. The guns stopped firing, the maps were redrawn, and the world, still smoking, tried to heal. But something remained, not in craters or medals, but in how war would be fought from that moment on. American artillery, during World War II, wasn't just dominant, it was revolutionary, and its violence became the foundation of modern battle planning. Every shell fired from Italy to the Ardennes didn't just destroy cover or kill soldiers, it drew new blueprints. After the war, as Europe mended and the Cold War dawned, generals of every nation reviewed battlefield data with brutal clarity. What worked? What failed? What truly broke the enemy? The answer was stamped over thousands of photographs, radio logs and shattered townships, battery coordination, massed fire, and proximity detonation. From this came the doctrine that NATO would inherit and adopt, a system built on 3 pillars born in the chaos of W2. Proximity fuses, invented mid-war, deployed with devastating effect. Instead of triggering on impact, shells now detonated just before reaching the target, maximizing airborne shock waves and lethality. At the Battle of the Bulge, this tech turned snowfields into shrapnel clouds, wiping out mass advances before a single rifle was fired. "You didn't need to hit a man anymore," said one artillery tech. "You just needed to be right above him." Saturation fire and grid targeting. Not lone shots, but entire maps lit up in sequence. American artillery in Normandy wrote the rules on timed barrages, where dozens of guns fired coordinated fire missions, shifting across zones with almost metronomic precision. British commanders called it drum fire. Germans called it death by calculation. The future called it NATO doctrine, forward observer integration. The man on the ground with eyes on the target became equal in power to a division's firepower. His radio spoke louder than battalions. In Korea, in Vietnam, in Iraq, American artillery would never fire blind again, because Watty proved that firepower guided by sacrifice could decide. War's post-war military manuals cited artillery, not as support, but as first strike priority. Tanks could break. Planes could rule airspace. But when you needed to unsettle a hill, split a town, or kill morale before your men ever arrived, artillery was the answer. It still is. The American way of war, a U.S. general wrote during the Korean War, isn't about starting the fight closest. It's about ending it loudest. And those lessons echo today in every NATO targeting grid, in every satellite data point relayed to a shell battery miles away, In every doctrine that begins the phrase, preparation fires begin at, they echo in war, games, live fire drills simulation, rooms. Even in peace, the rhythm of fire still echoes. That rhythm was born in the hedgerows of France, hardened in Italy's cliffs, and immortalized in the snow-blanketed woods of the Ardennes. Not an accident, not a reaction, but a strategy that said, let them never get close enough to shoot first. And if they do, they won't get to reload. Artillery was not the weapon of the future. It became the foundation of all that came next. This wasn't just a shell. It was a verdict. A steel sentence passed down at 2,000 feet per second. From cannons too far away to fear and too precise to miss. It didn't shout. It landed. And when it did, it didn't argue or hesitate. It ended whatever it touched. American artillery in World War II was not just a mechanical marvel. It was a philosophy, a strategy, a warning written in weight and velocity. It said, we will know where you stand. We will calculate the distance. And by the time you realize it, we're already firing. It wasn't rage. It wasn't personal. It was relentless, predictive, intentional. A rhythm of fire that broke not just formations, but mindsets. If fear was a weapon, then what caused more fear than fire that never came from a face? Not a soldier, not a bullet, but a sky-ripping storm triggered from beyond the horizon. By a whisper into a handheld radio. Subscribe to War II, Diaries for stories of weapons that didn't just win battles. They made sure some battles never happened. Again, weapons that challenged doctrine, exposed ego, and redefined what it meant to survive a war. This was artillery, the weapon they never saw, but never forgot.